Okay, let's dive into something pretty significant bubbling under the surface of the U.S. financial system. The latest FDIC report, Q1 2025, just dropped. And it really highlights, well, a huge amount of unrealized losses just sitting on bank balance sheets.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just, some abstract accounting thing. It connects directly to people's deposits, bank stability, maybe the whole system.
And what feels particularly noteworthy this time, based on the sources we're looking at, that's the official FDIC report plus an analysis pulling from it, is that, well, banks holding underwater assets isn't totally new, but the context,
Yeah.
that feels different now. We're seeing it alongside some other pretty major financial shifts happening.
Exactly. So our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack the numbers, try to understand why this mix of factors feels different today, what the potential ripple effects could be, and what some analyses are suggesting people should maybe be thinking about.
Right. So let's start with that FDIC report, the big number, the one that jumps out. U.S. banks are sitting on $413.2 billion in these unrealized losses.
$413.2 billion. That sounds massive, but unrealized. That always sounds like, well, it's not a problem yet, right? What does that actually mean?
That's a great question because the nuance is really crucial here. Think of it like this. Banks bought a ton of assets, mostly longer-term bonds, back when interest rates were, near zero.
Okay.
Now rates have shot up. So the market value of those old bonds, it's fallen a lot. They haven't sold them yet, so the loss isn't technically realized. It's on paper.
Right.
But that $413 billion, that's the hit they'd take if they had to sell today. And actually, the FDIC chairman even hinted the real number right now is probably even higher than what's in that Q1 report.
And we've seen how this paper problem can suddenly become very, very real, haven't we? The sources point straight to Silicon Valley Bank as, well, a pretty stark example.
Exactly. SVB had huge unrealized losses. Then depositors started pulling money out fast.
Right, the bank run.
Yeah. SVB needed cash, liquidity. So they were forced to sell some of those underwater bonds. That turned the paper loss into a very real, concrete loss. And that sale, it just triggered a crisis of confidence, the classic bank run, and poof, collapse.
And while, okay, the FDIC and Treasury did step in for SVB depositors, the source we're looking at asks a pretty critical question. Can you count on that happening every single time? Is that backstop guaranteed?
That's the worry.
Which brings us to the FDIC itself, its own capacity. The analysis really zooms in on this.
Yeah, this is where the scale of the potential issue gets clear. The FDIC's main safety net, the Deposit Insurance Fund, it has about $140.9 billion in it right now.
Okay, $140.9 billion. Initially, that sounds like a decent amount of money.
It does, yeah. Until you put it next to the total amount of deposits the FDIC is actually insuring. They cover deposits at nearly 4,500 banks across the U.S., and those deposits add up to over $10 trillion.
Wow. Okay, so $140 billion protecting over $10 trillion. That ratio the source mentions is kind of stunning. What is like 1.3 cents for every dollar insured?
Roughly, yes. About $1.30 for every $100 insured, basically.
Right.
And this leads to a key point in the source. You don't need some massive system-wide collapse to potentially swamp that fund. The failure of just a couple of decent-sized banks, or certainly one of the really big ones, the too-big-to-fail banks, it could make the math look unsustainable pretty quick.
Let's make that concrete. The source uses Bank of America as an example to show the scale.
Okay, yeah. So Bank of America, huge bank, holds around $2 trillion in deposits.
$2 trillion, okay.
The source points out about $600 billion of their assets, that's roughly a quarter of all their deposits, are tied up in those older bonds bought when rates were maybe, 1% or 2%. Super low.
Got it.
Because rates are so much higher now, the unrealized loss on just that chunk of their portfolio, it's over $100 billion.
Over $100 billion, just on that portion.
Just on that portion. So the insight here is pretty stark. If anything, forced a huge bank like BOA to sell a big chunk of those assets, or even if rates just kept climbing significantly, the potential hit to their balance sheet and, by extension, their ability to cover deposits. It's massive. The source uses the phrase, it would not be pretty for depositors in that kind of situation.
So, okay, you've got banks with these potential time bombs of unrealized losses. You've got the FDIC's fund looking, well, thin compared to the total deposits. But the story gets more complicated, doesn't it? The sources connect this bank fragility to another huge issue, the U.S. government's own debt situation.
Yes, and what's interesting about this analysis is seeing how these things, which seem separate, actually connect. This year, the U.S. is facing what some call a $7.6 trillion debt wall. That's how much existing government debt needs to be refinanced.
7.6 trillion. So basically, the Treasury needs to find buyers for trillions in new bonds just to pay off the old ones maturing.
Exactly. And this massive refinancing need, it's happening, according to the source, just as the traditional demand for U.S. debt seems to be, well, drying up a bit.
Demand is drying up. Why? Why now?
The source points mainly at foreign governments. Historically, they've been huge buyers of treasuries,
Right.
but the analysis suggests they're actively cutting back. They're diversifying into other things. Gold is mentioned specifically.
Gold. Why
Uh,
gold? And why are they cutting back on treasuries?
While the reasons cited include things like ongoing trade tensions, tariffs, growing worries about just how sustainable the U.S. debt path is, and maybe reactions to recent credit rating downgrades, too. As for gold, the source notes its key appeal. It has no counterparty risk. Its value doesn't rely on a government or a bank staying solvent.
Okay, so the government needs to borrow unprecedented amounts, and a big group of traditional buyers is maybe stepping back. What kind of cycle does that create?
It creates a pretty difficult feedback loop, it seems. Less automatic demand means the Treasury has to offer higher interest rates, higher yields to attract buyers for all this new debt.
Okay, higher yields needed.
But those higher yields, they cause a double whammy. One, they make the government's own borrowing more expensive going forward. And two, they make the unrealized losses on all those existing low-yield bonds held by the banks even worse. Higher rates push the market value of old bonds down further.
I see. So it digs the hole deeper for the banks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this whole cycle, the analysis suggests, could make holding dollar assets less appealing overall, potentially scaring off more buyers, pushing yields even higher. You see the loop.
Yeah, it sounds like a really tight knot. Banks struggling with losses that get bigger as rates rise, a government that has to push rates up to borrow, which makes the bank problem worse. So what happens if this keeps escalating? What are the potential outcomes the sources are talking about?
Well, if things really deteriorated, one possibility the source raises is the Federal Reserve might feel it has to step in, become the buyer of last resort for U.S. government debt.
The Fed starts buying treasuries directly. And the big concern there is usually inflation, right?
That's the view in this analysis, yes. That kind of action, essentially creating new money to buy the debt, would likely fuel more inflation. And we all know what that does. It just eats away at the value of savings, of wages, everything.
But the source talks about another potential path governments might take, one that sounds quite different from the old bailouts where they printed money. They mention bail-ins.
Right. This is a really critical point about how crises might be handled differently now. A bail-in, as the source describes it, it's where a failing bank is recapitalized not with taxpayer money from the outside, but by using its own internal resources.
Internal resources like what?
Chillingly, potentially funds from depositors, savings accounts, checking accounts, maybe even retirement funds held at that bank. The idea is converting some of that debt the bank owes depositors into equity or using it to pay off other creditors first.
And source says this isn't just theoretical. It points to places like Cyprus and Lebanon where this kind of thing has reportedly happened.
Yes, they do, and they paint a pretty grim picture of what it might feel like for an ordinary person.
How so?
They describe a scenario like, you wake up, try to check your bank account online, maybe go to an ATM, nothing works, access denied.
Okay.
You go to the bank branch, it's shuttered, doors locked, your money is just frozen. Then eventually you get notified that a big chunk the source uses 50% or even more as an example of your deposits has been taken essentially to help save the bank.
And they also add that this could happen during a period of high inflation. So any money you do eventually get back is worth way less.
That's the potential double hit they describe, yes.
Right.
Your funds are locked, maybe partially confiscated, and what's left buys less and less each day due to inflation.
Wow. And the source claims this bail-in process.
Yeah.
It's actually legal now in the U.S.
That's their assertion, yes, that the legal framework for using depositor funds in a bail-in scenario exists. Now, they do acknowledge authorities would probably try other things first, but the warning is basically, don't assume your deposits are absolutely sacred if a bank gets into deep trouble and the system's survival is prioritized over individual accounts.
Okay, so given this really complex picture, banks with potential losses, rising rates making it worse, government debt challenges, inflation risks, and this legally possible bail-in scenario. What does the source suggest people do? How do they protect their wealth?
The analysis we looked at is actually very direct here. It strongly recommends acquiring real, physical, tangible gold and silver.
Changeable gold and silver. What's the core argument for that, according to the source?
They position it as, well, real money, an asset that exists completely outside the traditional banking system, outside its controls. It acts sort of like an insurance policy against that systemic financial risk they're describing.
Hmm.
And the source observes that what they call smart money seems to be doing this already. They mention central banks buying gold like crazy, Wall Street firms reportedly accumulating it, foreign countries shifting away from paper assets.
Right. So they're saying follow the big players.
That seems to be the implication. The source definitely conveys a sense of urgency, too, suggesting that, waiting until a crisis is making headlines might be too late. They kind of advise trusting your gut feeling about the current financial climate.
It really brings up a fundamental question the source poses, doesn't it? If the traditional system, built on trust and, well, paper promises, has these potential weak spots, where do you find actual security, actual control over your wealth?
That's the core question.
So ultimately, our aim with this deep dive was just to lay out the concerns raised in these sources, the FDIC numbers, the analysis of what they might mean, so you're better informed about these financial undercurrents.
Yeah, understanding these potential pressure points in the system is just important context, really, for navigating the economy today.
So recapping the core tension highlighted by these sources, you've got the U.S. banking system dealing with maybe $500 billion, maybe more, in these hidden losses that could get worse. That's colliding with a government facing this enormous challenge of refinancing trillions in debt, just as global demand might be shifting.
Right.
And it creates this complex, maybe fragile situation with risks from inflation all the way to, in the worst case described by the source, the actual security of bank deposits.
And what the analysis really stresses is how linked these problems are. The bank's issues make the government's borrowing harder, and the government's borrowing needs and the resulting higher rates make the bank's issues worse. It's that feedback loop.
Which leaves you, the listener, with that big thought from the sources to mull over. In a world where so much of our wealth exists as digital numbers or paper promises within that traditional system, given the potential vulnerabilities we've talked about,
Right.
where do you feel your wealth is truly safe, truly secure, and truly under your own control?